Welcome to The Details with Adam Frower and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world. We do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So Cecil, one of the major things that's happening right now is recently Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of England,
I've heard of her,
has recently passed away, and country is in state of mourning. I suppose some people may be in a state of celebration, but England, especially, and many of the other countries where the Queen was the sovereign, they're preparing for funerals and the transition of power and all of those kinds of things. And so it seems like we would be remiss if we didn't consider what this might mean in a world today. So as you think about what this moment might mean and what sense we can make of it, what thoughts come to your mind?
Well, I mean, that's a big question in and of itself. So my brain has phases of reactions to what does this mean? And the first thought that comes to mind is that it could mean a lot of things. It also very much depends on the angle you're looking at it from. So it could mean a lot of different things to different people, at least on a personal level. I think another way to look at this is there's some functional differences for what this means. I mean, there has to be change now, right? Like the seat of power has changed and who's sitting in that seat and all the ramifications of that. But not to get too jumbled up in all of my thoughts at once, this idea, though, that, like you said, this could be time of mourning or a time of celebration to some people, or a time of different types of reflection over an era that meant quite a lot and speaks to people in a very inspirational way, but also an era that, saw maybe some historical atrocities that some people might interpret them as. So I think it very much depends on who's doing the looking and the interpreting when you try to answer the question of what does this change mean? And I think you haven't spent so much time in England. You could speak to the more sentimental side of things for what that could mean.
Yeah, I think you're right. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, I did live in England for a couple of years, but that was a long time ago. That was in the late 90s is when I was there. So it's been, over 20 years since I was there. But nonetheless, she was still the queen.
She was a spry 70-something.
Yeah, so she was still the queen at that time. And yeah, so it's interesting because I think you're spot on. I think it's highlighted because she is such a global figure that people may interpret this in many, many different ways. As I look at my own social media, I have some people predominantly here from the States who look at this moment as a much needed change, right? Where people are saying it's a time for us to reflect and to reevaluate what do we expect of our leaders? What do we want them to be? How do we want to hold them accountable and responsible for what happens? And there are other people who are on my social media feed who have known nothing but this queen for their entire lives, and people who live in England and who see this kind of as a very sad moment in history, kind of an end of life as we know it. And so I think that that's true, right? That the same event can mean something quite different depending on, and the way you said it was, who's doing the looking. And I think that obviously in our realm as clinicians, as family therapists, that same premise holds true. When we ask a very simple question like, what are your best hopes? The answers that we get will be very individualistic, that people who are experiencing the same thing within a family, they might give us entirely different answers. And in some sense, I think it's our job as clinicians to take a step back and look at the meta experience that's going on and try to pull together some commonalities potentially, or some points of negotiation, or points where it's going to be important for us to talk about the difference of meaning. And so I think that in some sense, we as a globe are getting an opportunity to talk about our different perspectives. And I think in some sense that could go very well. And I think in other senses, it might not go very well at all. But I think we have power in determining how those conversations might go.
Yeah. I don't know if I've ever put these thoughts into these words, but I definitely have felt these thoughts for a while about our work as solution focused clinicians. Is it seems a lot that in our jobs, there's a lot of effort put into finding the coexistence of certainly of hopes, but the coexistence of many things, you know, the reality that the client is in, including the difficult parts, that coexisting with the presence of whatever their best hopes is. And like you said, when we have a family or a couple or multiple people in the room at the same time, there's certainly the overlapping, the coexistence of their individual hopes. And our conversation has to be powerfully impactful, but directly at the intersection of all of those things. Because if we're outside of that Venn diagram somewhere, it's meaningless, less consequential. And so I think that's a brilliant idea to have that kind of perspective on something as global as this, since there are so many people looking at it from so many different directions. Some people on one side might say, I don't know that it's a two-sided thing to either. Some people of a certain perspective might say, you know, they look to her for inspiration, that the way she held herself and carried herself, there's a lot of dignity in that. And there's something to be learned from that, or that she is a cultural figure and that's meaningful to them. She was an icon of, you know, just a way of life that they come to value or that they were born in. While other people might say she represented a history of imperialism and other things that people would overtly say are not great things. And so if we were to, like you said, ask in a broad sense, what might be the best hopes of these perspectives? One side might say, I'd like to be able to hold my culture together. I'd like to be able to feel like I could find inspiration in the powerful figures who are, you know, kind of reigning over our nation or in the world. And other people might say, I'd like to know that the people in power are taking these kinds of things seriously, that they understand that imperialism has very negative consequences and that there's room for acknowledgement and somehow accommodating or understanding those things. And I think there probably is an intersection there, as we always have to find some intersection. There probably is somewhere in the middle that speaks to all of those things and allows everyone to kind of proceed forward together in some type of significantly positive way.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I think kind of embedded in what you're saying is there's meaning making that happens in these really pivotal moments, but that meaning making also happens oftentimes in the mundane moments that people bring into therapy, right? Where they say, we're in a relationship where we're just not getting along like we used to. And there can be meaning in that, and we can co-construct new meaning about what we want to be in a relationship. And so I think holding on to that meaning making is a really valuable thing to kind of hold on to in these moments, which I think brings up another point as well. Obviously, with the passing of the queen, she's not just the queen. She's a mother, she's a grandmother, she's a person.
Yeah.
And so her passing means something, I'm sure, to those people who are close to her.
Yeah.
And I think this is a moment where we can also be thoughtful about how do we deal with loss? How do we deal with someone who's close to us, whether in a positive way, maybe in a not so positive way? But what it means to lose a family member can also be quite different depending on who you're talking to. Again, who's doing the looking. I think about, for now, King Charles. He just lost his mother, somebody who he has had for 73 years of his life. Many people don't get to spend 73 years with their mother.
Yeah.
And probably as closely as he did, right? In some sense, she was also his predecessor, and he's got to step in to take her job.
Yeah.
And so he probably shadowed her in a lot of ways. She probably taught him a lot of the roles and responsibilities that he would take. And so he's simultaneously losing like a business partner, and he's losing his mother. He's losing a mentor who's kind of trained him to do this job. And so I'm sure for him, there's a lot of mixed emotion, and he being asked to mourn in some way, but at the same time, carry on the legacy. And I think each of us at moments of loss would probably deal with, maybe not to the gravity with which he's dealing with it, but that I want to mourn, I want to honor, I want to celebrate this person's life. At the same time, life has to carry on. And I have to, like he does, I have to go to work the next day. I have to do what I need to do. And so I'm sure that he's having kind of his own mixed bag of experiences that I think we as clinicians can take into consideration. The death of a person means several things potentially to the person I'm sitting with. But then if you expand that out to the family, right, you have what it means to each of the family members. And this one may be a little more controversial, but I think about what this might mean to Meghan Markle, right, who married into the family, who has, in at least the public eye, had a bit of contention with the Queen. The Queen has made disparaging comments, or at least stands toward who she is, what her children will look like, those kinds of things. And so I imagine that there's probably a breath of relief in some way to say, at least overtly, I'm not going to have to interact with her in that way. And how do I honor her in her role at the same time, not honor what she's saying and doing about me as a person? And so to put Meghan and Charles in the same room and say, deal with the loss of this person, I imagine they're having to struggle with, how do we deal with the loss of this person in a meaningful way for us?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is something that's true about grief and loss in general. I think we would very much like the idea that there's a one way that you're supposed to properly respond to loss. But clearly from what you're saying, it's impossible for there to be a one way, because there's no way that could fit the relationship, the context, the people, the individuals of every situation that's in connection with any loss. And so just as I think that, don't even know how many times, people come to therapy trying to figure out, how do I navigate this loss, whether this is a very functional deficit now in their life, or if this is just a very emotional difficulty that they're going through. Or even like you're saying, from the perspective of someone like Meghan Markle, there's this change in the dynamic of their family. And even though she's not on the side of, this was her own grandmother or someone who was very warm and open towards her, since this is something that was contentious, she has some other kind of way of navigating, or path to navigate in this grief. But I think what I've come to notice in having so many conversations with people about grief in this solution-focused kind of way is that not only is there not really a one way to go about it, I think it takes being open to figuring out your own way of going through it. Is there a certain right amount of busyness that you need? Like you said, Charles now has to kind of carry this role, in some sense, carry an institution, even though he's going through the grieving process. And that might be maybe potentially a partially good thing for him. Maybe he needs to feel like he's stepping into his mother's legacy, and that helps him really navigate this process. For some other people, I don't know what's true for him or not, but for some people, that could be a burden. That could be, this is getting in the way of me actually navigating this grieving process. And maybe someone might feel like they don't want that. They don't want to hold that position or those responsibilities at a time like that. And so I think in any perspective, any angle that you're coming from, there is this sense of there's a personalized way. Well, that makes it sound like there's a way it's supposed to be, but there's potential for a unique way to navigate through that grief. And I think a really important ingredient of that is being open to, well, what's the way for me? What's the way that could actually be really helpful and help me get a sense of the thing that I'm hoping for in this process, those best hopes that we mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's an important component. Is we don't often think about like the grief and loss process as something that we could do deliberately. And I think that what you're speaking to says, in some sense, we could be thoughtful about how we want to do this. Do we want to set aside some time to kind of sit with the feelings that I have? Do I want to stay busy? Do I want to be really purposeful about carrying on the legacy that I have? Do I want to use this opportunity to make amends with other people potentially about differences that we had? So there are, I think one of the things that's really valuable about considering things with this much detail is you could make choices, you could be purposeful even about something that oftentimes we think of as an emotional process, about I'm in the grieving process or I'm grieving this loss. And oftentimes we feel like it's outside of our control, that this experience is just something that's happening to us. And I think really one of the things that you're saying is we could potentially be thoughtful about what do we want this process to be like, and how if I think about that desired outcome or the place that I want to get to by the end of this, what does that look like? And that could then influence the decisions we make as we navigate this process.
Yeah, I think that is constantly true. Like you said, it is very easy to slip into this mindset that things that happen at us or to us. But I think there's a fraction of that sentence that's unnecessary. Things happen and we have to go on either way. We have no control over the weather, but there certainly are different ways we can go about our day depending on what the weather is like. If it's rainy, I gotta do things that fit with, well, what's my day like when it's raining? How do I stay dry? How do I still do the things that I need to do, even though that's happening? And I guess that brings us full circle back to the beginning where we were talking about the intersection of multiple things where, yes, this grief, this loss is going to stay a constant reality, but we also want that to intersect with what are the needs of the people involved in this right now? What's the context of their relationship to the loss right now? I think there's something at the middle of all of those things. People find themselves dissatisfied or maybe not navigating the grief process in the most satisfying way when there's something missing from that intersection. Like I said, there's some falling outside of the Venn diagram. A question I have for you, though, is there something to be taken away from all of this? Is there something people in general, regardless of the angle you're looking at this from, some meaning that you can grab from this moment?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that you might be able to grab from this moment. But I think just like other really pivotal moments in history, I think one of the things that can happen is that this is an opportunity for us to all say we're experiencing the same thing in some way. So there is an opportunity for us to come together through a sameness of experience. And I think when we come together in that, I think the same kind of thing at much greater detail happened when we all experienced COVID, right? There aren't many times where we experience something with that gravity all at the same time. But I think one of the things that can happen in that moment is that now we can, if we're thoughtful about it, we can say, what's your experience of this? How is that the same or how is that different than my experience of this? So I think these kinds of global events can be moments where we listen a bit more, where we try to understand what is your experience, what is my experience, what do we want to do with this experience. So I think it's an opportunity for us to come together and to hear differences and to negotiate those differences. I think the other thing that another kind of takeaway from this experience, especially as we were talking about grief and loss, if we bring it to our own immediate families, right? I worked with a lot of kids for a couple of years who were dealing with cancer. And sometimes those kids would pass away from their cancer. And I would watch families have to deal with something that they weren't expecting to deal with, that they didn't want to deal with. And some families navigated that process with as much ease as you can in a difficult situation. And other families were really kind of torn apart by the loss of a child. And I think there's something to learn as we go through this grieving process is that in some sense, although we're all experiencing the same thing, it means something different to each one of us. And the families that I watched who navigated that process well, they didn't expect each other to grieve in the same way, right? I mean, perhaps there was one parent who was like, I just have to stay busy. I have to stay distracted. I have to just get on with things because if I slow down, it becomes overwhelming. And another parent would sit in the feelings and grieve and cry and wonder what would have happened if they hadn't passed away. And so oftentimes they would deal in very different ways. But families that navigated it well gave permission for you to do it your way and me to do it my way. And so there was more of an acceptance. There was a more openness to say, this is where I am right now, or this is what I need. This is how I want to process through this. And so with the differences came an opportunity to communicate a bit more. And so I think this, obviously not all of us are experiencing the loss of the Queen in this personal way.
Right.
But I think one of the takeaways is to say, however somebody else is experiencing this, that's an okay way to be experiencing it. It allows us to be a bit more tolerant. It allows us to need to be more overt about the communication of this is what's going on for me, what's going on for you. And so I think as we navigate losses, as we navigate these world events, there are opportunities for us to be overt about where we are. It gives us an opportunity to be tolerant of one another, to say, however you need to manage that, this is an okay way for you to manage it.
I would love to see that happen in this instance, but with, like you said, any world event, any topic of substance that drifts across social media. Because it feels like the usual fuel is what's the side I can cling to and very passionately say is correct. And I suppose, when there are ethical questions at the center of some things, there probably is a more correct answer. But it more often than not seems like there's more emphasis on division and why some group is bad or wrong or even just different, and that inherently means bad, rather than, like you said, an acceptance of there's room for all of this. I have my meaning making, I have my process, I have my understanding, and that's not threatened by the existence of someone else's difference in that stuff. In fact, maybe we actually can enhance each other's understanding and processes because of those differences, which I know is something you've talked about with Elliot plenty of times.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess if I had to summarize takeaway is we all make meaning in really, really different ways. And things like this can be reminders to us of let's pause in this moment of reflection and let's try to be tolerant of one another. Let's try to understand what this means to each other. Let's try to find a sense of unity, even though our experiences might be quite different. And I think as we do that, we can really kind of pull together a support for one another during these moments instead of creating further division from something that maybe we didn't want to happen or we weren't expecting to happen. And so I think these moments can really be moments of growth that we can cling to each other.
Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.